Thank you for coming. We're very lucky to have two great people on the panel tonight. We've got Dr. Tomas Chamorro from UCL. He's a business psychologist. He's over from New York, so very lucky. He's flown over just for this, I think. Probably for loads of other things as well. But, and then we've got Patrick Collister, who's head of design at Google and has had a very colourful career in advertising. And so I guess the whole point today is about talking about cross-discipline duos.
I was the creative director of a whole range of agencies, and I guess about a year ago, a year and a half ago, I started a bit of a shitstorm when I posted a comment on a website saying, "What do you call a designer who can't use a computer?" Answer, an art director. And of course this caused a kind of quite a lot of offence really, which I suppose was deliberate. It is so interesting, isn't it? When I was the creative director of Ogilvy and Mather, I banned computers from my art directors' offices, telling them that I hired them to think, not to play. And so it struck me, thinking about it, and the big changes that have happened in our industry, moving from creative director of Ogilvy to now creative director of a small team inside Google, is that in the old days, you know, the Doyle, Dane, Birnbach creative team of writers and art directors, these were thinkers. I started life as a copywriter. I didn't do anything. I wrote a script, but somebody else shot it, somebody else edited it, somebody else did the music. And as an art director, you were called an art director because you directed other people to take the photograph, you directed a typographer to do it. So all we did was we just sat there and talked a lot. Now for me, I think actually the real revolution in our business is that through digital there is a new kind of creative person, and I call them creeks. And creeks are creative geeks. And what they do is very, very different. Where writers and art directors operated through words and through pictures and with layout pads, essential to the creek is a box of Lego and some sticky back tape. Because what they do is they make stuff. And certainly in my team at Google, what I've seen is this dramatic change. So let me tell you about a creek called Yort, who works for us. We got a brief from Philips, and basically Philips's problem is that people aren't brushing their teeth for long enough. Now the standard response from a creative team in an ad agency would be to write advertising, create a message or branded content about basically how your teeth are going to rot if you don't actually brush them for 2 minutes every morning, 2 minutes every evening. Yort, being a creek, his solution was to come up with a piece of technology. And essentially what this box did, and his prototype, was it delivered 2 minutes of content to you every morning. So you push a button and it tells you what your calendar is for the day. It tells you what the news is relevant to you and your interests. It tells you what's happening in social media, and it feeds you the stuff that actually it knows you're really interested in for 2 minutes. And when it ends, you can stop brushing your teeth. Now for me, that is a creek. And what is absolutely fantastic about this as a solution is that where creative people, writers and art directors create PowerPoint presentations. Mr. Client, thank you so much for coming in today. What we have for you is an idea that we think will actually work across all of your different, suddenly Yort is saying to the client, I want to talk to you in your bathroom. And what he's doing is presenting to the client a box, a prototype in his bathroom, and the client's going, this is fucking amazing. And I've got to tell you, I've done few creative presentations where a client has looked at my PowerPoint and gone, this is fucking amazing. And so for me, the creek is a person now who makes stuff. And it's really, really interesting. So again, I'll shut up in a second. I know it's only supposed to be a minute, but one of our creative teams down in Australia were working with M&C Saatchi on Optus, and Optus is the #3 telecoms brand there. So there are a couple of big beasts, and they're #3 by a distance. And don't ask me how the idea emerged, but they created a prototype for a buoy they called Clever Buoy, B-U-O-Y. And what it did is it used image recognition technology from your mobile phone to see if there were sharks swimming around the place. And by and large, actually, in their tests, their rudimentary tests, it seemed to work. And then it uses the Optus network in order to be able to then send an SMS message to the coast guards, the lifeguards sitting on the beach. Really clever. Except, as a traditional advertising agency guy, I'd say this is scam. You know, they created one prototype, the testing of it is incredibly dodgy, there's no real science behind it. All they've done is make a 2-minute video and upload it to YouTube. And then, by the way, they won a whole load of awards at Cannes for it. Bastards. Now, here's the really interesting thing, though, is that because it's an interesting story, the press got hold of it. Around Australia, newspapers took it up, blogs and vlogs took it up, because they have 14 shark attacks a year, and if this is a solution to those 14 attacks a year, then it's something they really want to know about. 6 months after this so-called scam video ran, unprompted awareness of Optus as a technology brand had increased by 84%. And this was because a group of people made something that allowed the brand to do rather than to talk. So rather than messaging, we're now in the business of creating stuff where a brand demonstrates its values and then allows people. I mean, it drives me crazy, this word storytelling. It used to drive me fucking crazy. But in the old days, I suppose we told stories about brands. Today, the new paradigm is how do we create ideas that get people talking to each other about them? So for me, that's the new creative, somebody who is in the business of Lego, sticky back tape, making stuff.
So my name is Tomas. I'm a professor of business psychology here at UCL and also at Columbia in New York. I also run 2 businesses, consultancies that focus on leveraging an understanding of people, mostly for 2 main areas of the real world. One is talent and HR, which is kind of dull and dry, but a lot of organizations, you know, demand or have interest in tools that can help them understand people. And the second area of application is consumer behavior, you know, understanding how people relate to brands. And at the interface of these 2 fields is my interest in creativity, human creativity. How can you understand, predict, develop, influence, nurture creativity at the individual and at the team level? And I guess that's why I'm here. I'm interested in leveraging or contributing to the discussion between theory and practice on how we can, you know, make the world a more creative place. Just to give you an overview of my work and stuff that I have done that explores you know, things like collaboration and creativity. And there's one particular example that I want to give you, although you should try it out. This is a game we created 3 years ago called Insanely Driven. It's an interactive movie, so shot from a point of view. And there was a very collaborative component to it because we had to work with an advertising agency, with a marketing agency, with game developers, and then with the client. You know, consumer goods company. And so that was an interesting example of putting, you know, people together who don't normally talk to each other, academics, game developers, advertising, marketeers, and clients. And at the same time, it's interesting because this interactive movie profiles you for creative talent. Okay, so once you play, you get a score, and with that score, you know, we're supposed to infer your creative potential. The client use that to recruit creative people and use it internally to build creative teams or teams that work in innovation. You can skip through this. Next slide. Okay, a lot of the work that I have done also in my kind of a real world consultancy involves advising organizations on how to manage creative talent. This is an article I published a couple of years ago in Harvard Business Review and angered the creative community. The original title was 7 Rules for Managing Creative People, because there were very, very quickly like thousands of angry comments by people who saw themselves as creative. They decided to change the article to creative but difficult people, you know. Sort of the comments confirmed this idea, stereotypical idea, that sometimes the people who are most likely to contribute to innovation are also quite difficult, unpredictable, high maintenance, and organizations are often not willing to put their money where their mouth is. I mean, we all say that we want to see innovation, that we should tolerate risk and failure, but in practice, few people do it. I don't know if it's different in the creative industries, but certainly in other sectors. And some of the work that we do also explores the issue. This is more experimental work we do on whether you can actually make people more creative. Okay, so there are basically 2 big challenges that organizations face today. Attracting people who are already somewhat creative is not that difficult. You can work it out based on their portfolio, expertise, and even evaluating their potential is not that difficult. What's more challenging is putting up or managing people who are creative but have big egos and are maybe somewhat narcissistic and antisocial from a personality perspective, and also making people who are naturally not that creative more creative. And you can't make somebody who is really not creative, you can't turn them into a creative genius or an innovator, but there's about a 20 or 30% range that you can stretch into one direction or another. So here's a summary of the things that you can do to boost creative performance and unleash whatever creative potential people have. And this is actually a very, very old framework that we use in psychology that is quite helpful and is used a lot in businesses. Although it is not that easy to boost creative thinking skills, to turn somebody into a divergent, original thinker. If you don't have that, even if you exercise or train that a lot, it won't change very much. But boosting expertise is critical to improving creative output, and sometimes lay people think that there is a negative relationship between expertise and creativity. The more you know about something, the harder it is to be creative, but that's not the case. You can only be creative in a field if you have expertise, and training and developing expertise is quite simple. And the other factor that you can influence is motivation. Put people to work on tasks that are meaningful and have a purpose for them, and even if they're not naturally very creative, they will be more creative because they'll find it more interesting. So one of the businesses that I run specializes in identifying and developing entrepreneurial potential. And we work with an academically valid model of entrepreneurship that we've developed over the past 5 or 6 years. And I think what's interesting about this is that there are these 4 phases or components of entrepreneurship, which is basically the ability to turn something creative into something innovative, to turn a latent or abstract or conceptual creative idea into something that is an original or innovative product or output or service. And creativity is just one phase. You also need to be opportunistic and identify gaps in the market. You also need to follow through and execute whatever plan or idea you have. And you also need to have a long-term plan or vision, that turns that into an actual enterprise. And it's very rare for people to tick the 4 boxes. So usually, the challenge and what organizations or even startups should do, we work a lot advising startups on how to be more innovative or achieve their entrepreneurial goals, is build teams where different individuals can ensure that each of these components or phases are covered.
So you talk in the managing creative but difficult people.
Yeah.
Talk about there's one element of that was talking about how you twin them with different types of people.
Right.
So Are you starting to notice in the businesses that you're in that this kind of clash is really powerful for creative teams, to bringing people from very different backgrounds, different perspectives, to create this, I guess, this magical team?
I would say that a vast majority of organizations today, maybe 70% or whatever that is, pretend to care about creativity. So if you go to their websites, they will have creativity as one of their core values, much like diversity and corporate social responsibility. But when you ask people who work there whether any of these things are true, they say no, it's the opposite. It's actually. So I don't think organizations are doing much to make creativity happen. And if anything, they think that because creativity is by definition unpredictable and more of an art than a science, there aren't any evidence-based approaches or methods that can be implemented to boost it. And that's a mistake. Much like there is a science to managing people, there is a science to managing creative people and to boosting creativity and innovation in organizations.
But if I go back, not all that long, and in a lot of agencies today, the creative process is linear. So a client thinks he's got a problem and he briefs an agency, and the account man gets a planner to rewrite the brief, who takes it back to the client, who goes, oh, okay, maybe. Then it goes into a creative team, because we put value on creative teams to be able to solve it. They spend 2 weeks, they then show an idea to the client, who totally fucking freaks, by the way, at this stage. No, I didn't mean that. And by the way, your insertion date, air date hasn't changed, so now you've got a snafu, and what you do is you end up with something that is compromised. Today, and I think I'm in a unique team and in a unique position to be able to encourage a nuclear creative process. So at the very beginning, you bring together a group of disparate talents, including the client, by the way, including industry analysts like Jonathan there, including planners, including creative people, including some of the developers and engineers. And to be honest, there's nothing you can't solve with that group of people around a table. And so quite often what happens, you bring them together to discuss the problem, then you do the brief, then you hand it over to the people who are going to implement it. And for me, I sometimes look at traditional agencies and I think I can understand why the account directors hate this, because all of their experiences told them that they're going to really need the money 3/4 of the way through this linear process when it's gone snafu. And they hate investing money in time and resource at the beginning. But actually, that's where you solve things today.
Have you seen in anything that you've done or any place that you've worked where you really far and disparate individuals have been brought around, right, beyond just planners and creatives, but psychologists or neuroscientists? How far have you seen these teams go, and have you seen it from a strategic perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think you can have people who are too different or opposite working together. Certainly there can be synergies and positive level of creative tension if they are slightly different and see things slightly differently and are complementary, but at least they have to get along, from a personality and values perspective, and they can't be totally so different that they're incompatible. And if you look at the research on social networks in organization that maps informal dynamics of relationships between people at work, it is often people who are not meant to work together formally that create the most effective teams, and where the most interesting ideas are incubated and generated are. And that's because they are slightly different, but also they like each other and they think alike, at least in terms of values and interests, And so I think one of the implications of this research is we can learn from these informal networks that are generating organically or spontaneously in organizations and try to recreate them more formally or explicitly.
I think when you do bring in very different people, then what happens is conflict and tension, and that's fantastic. You know, we were just talking earlier, my team has just done psychological profiling. And actually, if anyone really took a serious interest in it, they'd immediately fire our boss because she is quite plainly demented from... but of course, everyone looks at all of this and goes, oh, isn't that interesting? If you were to really take the data and to try and create a multi-talented team using all that psychological profiling, half of us would get shoved out of the building, you know. And the other thing that would happen is that we'd all be terribly nice to each other and we'd do complete shit, you know, because you do need, I mean, my analogy sometimes is kind of like AC/DC, electrical current. It's constantly going backwards and forwards. And really good creative environments are in which actually there is that constant tension, because what you're trying to do is to produce something that is of value. And so...
He's going deaf, by the way, the AC/DC singer.
Is he?
Yeah. He told to stop, but he's not going to stop.
He's even older than I am. Of course he's going deaf.
Well, we know
he's just lucky he's not blind, you know. But anyway... So I think bringing in disparate talents is good. I do think that there's a terrible myopia in the advertising and marketing industry, which is fascinating. You go along to an advertising conference, it's filled with advertising creative directors talking about jingles and fucking slogans, you know. But if you go to a medical conference, there'll be an anthropologist there, there'll be a historian there, there'll be a neurologist. I mean, tonight is exceptional in that we do have an academic, we've got a neuroscientist there, and people with really different perspectives. And actually, I think that's really, really interesting. A lot of agencies are hermetically sealed, and I think as a result of that, you know, 85% of all the advertising we produce is unnoticed because it's just bilge. So bringing people in who've got a different perspective, great, yes.
Problems you're talking about are things that people need or things that are changing things, right? The life buoy, people brushing their teeth to a more effective, you know, I think I don't know, it's interesting that there's, would you bring those engineers, those creaks into make a TV ad? Maybe. Would you want to?
I mean,
you know?
No, it is interesting. You should ask that because I was the creative director for 2 fairly miserable years for both them and me of a digital direct marketing agency, and we merged with a digital design studio in order to go digital, and I did do that. I put writers and art directors together with creeks, with code writer. It was a terrible failure, actually, because again, I made the mistake of thinking that they were all thinkers, and they aren't. You know, a lot of digital people are makers and doers, but also they operate to totally different timelines as well. So I had some people working insanely hard and other people just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. But it was an attempt to do it. And that's why I go back to the idea now of a kind of a talent pool. I mean, I've always thought that the way they make movies is just the most brilliant way of managing creative talent, because all of these people are freelance and they come in with their specialist skills. They're absolutely essential to that part of making the movie, and then they go away again. The production company is probably 3 people. You know, the director is contracted, you know, the maker, everybody. And yet agencies seem to think that it's still really important to have people of a very specific kind under their roof. And the moment you do have that, then the tail wags the dog. You know, when we work together, you know, you've got a room full of people who are really good at direct marketing, writing DM. So every response to a brief is, God, it's got to be a fucking letter because I've got all of these people who write them day in, day out. And if you've got an advertising creative department filled with people who can write TV scripts, that's the response. But for me, the agency, already the model is actually at the heart, you need a handful of people who are media savvy, brand literate, and who are able to understand what an idea is and then work with disparate talents in order to be able to deliver a multitude of different creative responses to that.
There is quite a lot of discussion about organisational structure and holacracy, etc. And I wondered whether, Thomas, you have specific comments on that. But others are that you are starting to move into a sort of period of platform economics in terms of Elance, etc., and you're looking at the way that freelance economies work, and HMRC has probably got data that shows about 0.3% of GDP is now in this, nominally sharing economy model activity. And I wondered whether you saw those trends in terms of technology being able to allow communication between rapidly assembled teams starting to shift the way companies actually work.
I think that the film industry model is indeed the way to go, and it should be emulated in other industries. And I do think that we will eventually shift towards a talent on demand model, which you're seeing already in the sharing or gig or people to people economy, mostly because a lot of people who have full-time jobs are supplementing that already with other types of whether it's self-employment or entrepreneurial activities. The reason for that is, I think that people, it's being driven by what people want, because people see that they can fulfill maybe their creative goals or needs in traditional employments. So they're fed up and they're badly managed, and I don't think that holacracy or adhocracy or any type of formal structure is a solution to that, because informal structures are what matter, and you can have a structure, a group or a team with no formal hierarchy and no formal leader, but still somebody will be in charge and still somebody will call the shots, and people need that to get organized. Happiness is a very selfish goal, I think. It doesn't make if your goal in life is to be happy, civilization doesn't benefit, Anything that has been produced in the world in civilization that is of value was the result of unhappy people who were dissatisfied with the status quo, and they were so angry that they did something to change it. If your goal is to be happy, good for you, but bad for everybody else. It's a very wishy-washy, neo-hippie idea from the west coast of America mostly, and you shouldn't buy into it. Stay unhappy and do something about it.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I always used to say, quite a lot of the creative people who work for me were miserable bastards. But I used to say it beats the shit out of mining. And it does, I gotta tell you.
It's a good motivation.
Yeah.
So really enjoying the chat so far, guys, and the model you describe, I guess mimicking what the film industry does about bringing disparate talent together to work and fulfill a project or a job. It's exactly how we set up our agency. So good to hear we're ahead of the curve. But what you'll probably know and find as well is that brands tend to be maybe 2 or 3 years behind what agencies are doing for their model. So the problem there becomes, how do you get the credibility, or how do you, I guess, you have to peacock to an extent to be able to get the job in, and the client only wants to pay one vendor, and then you have to assemble the team in the background. So I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of how we can bridge that with brands to have them catch up to this new agile model, which doesn't hinder creative, it actually accelerates it.
Every year I publish something called the Director of Big One Rankings, which is a list of the most awarded agencies and the most awarded campaigns. And this year I stripped out all of the NGO and pro bono advertising to see what the rankings look like. And one agency had absolutely no pro bono advertising on its books at all, and that was Droga 5. Which is really, really fascinating, because when they started, everything they did was for NGOs, for charities, was for pro bono. And so how they survived, I don't know, but everything they did was in order to demonstrate their creative credentials, but also how to use tech in new and interesting ways. And now everything they do is commercial. And so that's what they did. They just created a reputation, and now the business has followed. So there's a model.
I guess I'm particularly interested in building that core team you mentioned, the people that have a media savvy, brand aware, the people that are harder and harder to get and keep because they want to be freelance. And what you think, I guess, it's obviously clear to all of us, I think we're all agreed that bringing in expertise is the thing to do, and bringing in that team. But what do you think makes that core team, and how do you build the best people that you can bring your expertise around?
I think, personally, I think there are two issues here. And the first issue is, I think the Chief Creative Officer is in the wrong place. I don't think the Chief Creative Officer belongs in an agency. I think he belongs inside the marketing organisation and should sit alongside the CMO. Because today, it is incredibly complicated, first of all, to understand what your brand positioning idea is, but then how that's going to be translated across all of these different channels with their very, very different disciplines and needs. And that requires a very particular skill set. And so if you've got a Chief Creative Officer inside a client company, then that's somebody who is able to brief and interpret and explain and then get the best out of subsidiary agencies. In terms of your particular dilemma, I think what you need is a different kind of person altogether. And when the digital revolution happened, I got really, really excited because I thought this meant agencies were going to start recruiting totally a different kind of person from different kind of backgrounds. So rather than creative people coming from art school backgrounds, what we'd be looking at are people who were just media savvy, had some of the entrepreneurial skills that you were talking about, who made stuff and did stuff. And then what you'd do is you'd take a punt on them. So one of the very first people I hired at Ogilvy when I started the digital unit there was a guy called Saul Klein. And Saul demonstrated absolutely all of those things, that savviness, and then created his own digital brand consultancy before then creating Love Film, which he sold to Amazon for 350 million, and is now, by the way, back in the whole business of investing in startups in this whole kind of tech area. So it's finding people who are media aware, really fascinated in people, so the psychology and those planary skills, but actually who don't fit any of those traditional bloody buckets.
I think it's the film model. In a traditional agency environment, you really need and value the brand experience that fixed brand or account teams have. And if you always bring in freelancers in and out, those freelancers just don't have that experience, and you still need it. So what structures do we create that allow for both advantages and disadvantages of both the talent, the non-fixed talent and the fixed teams, and how do we change our business models to account for that?
There is the essential contradiction. On the one hand, when you build a team, creative people are incredibly competitive. Last year we logged 12,500 separate pieces of communication that won gold, silver or bronze, and we all go to awards shows. And as I always like to say, it's not great when you win, it's just bloody brilliant to see other people lose, and we take delight in it. So building a team that has a sense of identity and purpose, and to hell with those bastards at Saatchi's, fuck them, all of that is really, really important. On the other hand, they're really expensive. And a load of those people have very specific skills that you may not need. So I think it's a mixture of both. Again, I go back to your model. At the core, you have a group of people who don't belong to old-fashioned silos. You're not an account man, you're not a planner, you're not a creative person, you're not a media planner, you're not a data analyst, you're the whole bloody lot of those. And as a group of people, you get used to sitting together around a table, and then you bring in the resource as and when you need it. And because if your purpose is honourable and if your purpose is elevated, then people feel really good about it. If it's okay, guys, we've brought you in, we're looking for a really small idea here, don't spend too long on it, just do something pretty average, all right? Then you're doomed. But actually, if you bring a whole load of people going, we think we've got a really great opportunity here, because there's a really different way of doing this. We've identified that we could do that and the other. We found a client who is mad enough to actually want to invest in this. Then you get that, that buy-in.
They are contradictory, right? So we have here the professional sports team model and here the film industry. We're just using these terms now to explain what we just described, and the rest of the world somewhere in the middle. First of all, this is more feasible. It's unlikely that it can gravitate towards this end. And even if you look at the professional sports team model, Leicester will be disassembled completely by next season. You know that. So except maybe Man United during the Ferguson era and Barcelona now, those are exceptions. But we can't expect the world of business to adopt the model that professional sports teams adopt, because well, not only are they not aware of that, I mean, in professional sports, people spend 90% of the time training, 10% of the time performing. In the world of the rest of business industries, you're lucky if it's the other way around, right? Which business has people spending 5% of the time training? It will be an anomaly. It will be a waste of resources by most. And also the rules of the games and the parameters are such here that there are very, very clear metrics to evaluate team performance, and people clearly have to achieve through teams. Here it's just wishy-washy, and we're, I mean, mostly living in a world that glorifies individualism and promotes people for you know, nepotistic networking and individualistic behavior. So the rules allow for other things to happen and systems to be naturally more corrupt and parasites.
So surely one of the most distinctive features about the new world of advertising is that your audience, your target audience, is incredibly finely stratified. So it used to be before that you would target some broad group and you'd be going for the mean of that group, whereas now you might be able to characterize your audience across a very large number of dimensions. So it's really individual advertising you can now deliver on somebody's phone. So doesn't this mean that your teams also have to reflect that kind of broad diversity of targets themselves? Because it may well be that in order to match that richness in terms of the audience, you have to match that richness in terms of the team.
You know, when I was running Ogilvy and Mather, 84%, thank you for that one, 84% of all of our clients were aiming their advertising at women. I had more women in my creative department than any other agency, but it was only 11%. So basically I had 28, 29-year-old boys writing ads to housewives, and I've got to tell you, they weren't very good at it, actually.
I was saying it's all about the width of the distribution, where the distribution of characteristics is very wide, then just targeting the mean, or the mean plus minus something, will only get you a small percentage of the market.
But
the
there's
beauty
very
of
little
individuation is
personalization. There's very little personalization anyway.
At the moment.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
surely because you now know who you're delivering to.
But
you
people
can
still
ramp that
optimize
up.
for the normal distribution, and you know, I mean, there's behavioral targeting, but there's no personalization of products.
But somebody who did that, and surely that's the future to come, ought to sweep up.
But I agree with her that you can do that without having a person that is like the consumer, or one-to-one, you know, matching. I mean, it's, yeah, and your example, I think.
In a literal way, I'm not saying you have to have exactly the distribution of the population, of course.
In
It's
any
a bit
event,
like
more
saying you have
diverse
to-
teams are usually advantageous. You know, usually you will be able to come up with more interesting or novel things. If not everybody, if there is no group thing and not everybody is the same and not everybody is a clone from each other. You know, the organizations that have a very strong culture end up being cultish, like, you know, and then they just see things in one way, and that's unlikely to produce something creative.
You're absolutely right. Digital allows us to come up with segmentation strategies that are really, really meaningful. And so then I'm looking at people like Jonathan there, who understands data and analyzes that, to be able to tell me what a target audience looks like and what is the insight that drives their behavior. And the truth is, the moment I've got that insight, then actually it's dead straightforward. All I have to do is to make sure that the relevant message gets in front of them. So being able to understand what those different groups are is really, really crucial to creativity moving forward. And broadcast media, where you are having to be as general as possible, actually online you don't. You can be really, really specific. And actually that's really, really exciting too.
What do you kind of see as the makeup of a creative team or duo in, say, kind of 15 years' time?
Superficially, the world changes a lot, and certainly technology enhances the illusion of change, and this idea that, you know, the world has never been as complex as it is, and I mean, that's just bullshit, basically. From the perspective of experience, the world was far more complex 2,000 years ago for the average inhabitant of the world than now. Now, technology is complex, but it has made most things easier, quicker, simpler, and you don't have to think that much, you know. Now, I do think that that has implications for every area of work, and vis-a-vis creativity, I think the composition of teams will be slightly different, and I do think that what's the expression of creeks, you know. Maybe it was unthinkable to see a place for them, a role for them in creative professions 50 years ago or 80, or there was the proportion or representation was a lot smaller. Now, by then, maybe there will be half or the majority, and I do think that it will be harder for people to survive in that team if they don't believe in data, evidence, and they completely ignore, you know, the science. So I think maybe it will be a more of a fusion, a sci-art fusion between not just people who think more convergently and logically and analyze and look at data, and people who are more intuitive. Of course, you need both. If you don't have ideas or ask the right questions, the data won't tell you anything. And maybe that will be enhanced with machines, you know, that are not fully able to replace or dehumanize us, but will work alongside us. You know, if I think that will be a safe prediction.
Well, I think the creative team is already finished in most agencies. The writer, art director pairing. It's just bloody expensive, and for starters, and actually, it's not very satisfactory either. So for me, the creative team is a group of people who come together in order to solve a problem. And fundamental to that, I want the marketer there, because he's essential. I really, really do. Planning is a creative function. You know, data-driven planning is absolutely essential, because I really want an insight that is based on fact. You know, as a creative director, I always used to think my job was to have the agency's opinion. And I didn't want a planning director coming in and giving me his or her opinion. It was irrelevant. Tell me what you know. And when you've got people like that in a team who can tell you stuff that they know, and the data provides the evidence, that's fantastic. Then I want people who are able to think imaginatively and inventively, because by and large, most of us are now in the business of innovation. So how do we do things that are new in order to be able to have some kind of an effect? So I think writers and art directors, you know, people like me, are pretty much yesterday's people.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, well done, mate. Cheers. Thank you.